Listen closely. What I am about to tell you was never meant for public ears. It was hidden, not because it lacked importance, but because its truth was too corrosive, too dangerous, too revealing of what Victorian society and its institutions truly were. Imagine this: a boy who never spoke, never ate with the others, never laughed, and never wept. He only watched, and when he moved his hands, he carved death into the air with surgical precision, as if he already knew the mistakes the doctors would make before they ever made them. They called him Patient 43, but within the walls of Earlswood Asylum, he was whispered about as something else entirely, the shadow that rehearsed death until death obeyed. It begins in the winter of 1864, Surrey, England. The countryside was hushed beneath frost, but inside the iron gates of Earlswood Asylum, the cries of the unwanted filled the air. Earlswood was a proud institution, the model asylum of Victorian England, a place meant to transform the feeble-minded into useful workers. That was the public story. Behind the walls, it was a warehouse of the forgotten, an experimental ground for medical men eager to carve reputations on the bodies of the abandoned. Into this theater of cruelty arrived a nameless boy. No escort, no mother's hand, no family at all. A parish officer delivered him with only a note. Found incapable of common schooling, non-verbal, unfit for parish care. No one asked where he came from. No one asked why he was different. He was simply branded with a number, as though identity itself had been taken from him at the gate. Patient 43. From the first day he did not behave like the others. The idiots of the ward were loud, restless, broken by poverty and shame. But this boy sat perfectly still, his pale hands folded on his lap, his eyes unblinking, fixed always on one figure. Dr. William Harrington, the asylum. As surgeon, wherever Harrington's hands moved, the boys followed, invisible blades slicing the air in silent unison. At first, attendants thought it mimicry, the meaningless repetition of a damaged mind. But there was something too exact in the rhythm, too precise in the angles. He was not guessing, he was rehearsing, and then it happened. The surgeon's hand slipped, a cut too deep, an accident recorded in the official ledger. But the staff remembered what the boy had been doing days before, jerking his wrist, clutching his own arm as though already wounded. They whispered, it wasn't an accident, it was prophecy. The boy had shown them the surgeon's mistake before it was ever made. That is when the erasure began. The ledger where his name was written was scratched, rewritten, then blotted with heavy ink. His presence was buried in silence. But whispers spread faster than ink could hide. Patient 43 was not an idiot. He was an omen. What you must understand about the Victorian asylum is this: it was not just a place of medicine, it was a machine of control. Families deposited their undesirables behind its gates to be silenced. Surgeons tested their theories upon those who could not resist. Records were altered, lives erased, and truth itself, was considered a disease to be treated with ink and denial. Patient 43 was different because he disrupted that system. His existence revealed what no asylum governor, no surgeon, no polite Victorian reformer dared admit, that something moved within those walls beyond medicine, beyond science, beyond control, a child who spoke not with words, but with the inevitability of death itself. Night after night, attendants swore they saw his fingers twitching in the lamplight, drawing invisible incisions across the dark air. He did not sleep, he rehearsed. Every cut, every suture, every slip of the surgeon's blade, he performed them endlessly until they ceased being accidents and became inevitabilities. He was not just reflecting Harrington, he was dictating him. And this was what terrified the staff more than madness, more than violence, more than blood itself. The possibility that the surgeon, the man of authority, the one with scalpel and license and power, was no longer in control of his own hands, that his fate was being rehearsed by a silent child in the shadows. Ask yourself, why was this boy erased from history? Why is his number found only in whispers, his story buried beneath ledgers struck through with ink? The answer is not because he was meaningless. It is because he was too dangerous. Dangerous not as a patient, but as proof. Proof that within those walls, something other than science reigned. something that mocked the authority of doctors and governors, something that revealed how fragile control truly is. By the time the staff began calling him the Shadow, it was too late. He had already become something else, a mirror to the surgeon's hand, a rehearsal of the surgeon's death. And what the governors feared most was not simply superstition, it was the collapse of their narrative. For if one boy could dictate the future of a surgeon, what else could be dictated? How much of their power, their control, their authority was only an illusion, waiting for a silent child to expose it? This is the story you were not meant to hear, and now that you've heard it, you cannot go back. Patient 43 was erased for a reason, because once you know him, you begin to see the world differently. You begin to wonder how much of your own life is mimicry, how much of your own fate is rehearsed by hands you cannot see. Earlswood Asylum was not merely a hospital, it was a cathedral of control. The Victorians called it the Grand Experiment, but in truth it was a fortress where inconvenient lives were hidden away, walled off from polite society. From the outside it looked almost noble, tall red brick wings, spired ruins, manicured lawns, but step past its gates and you entered a factory of silence where bodies were catalogued, stripped and reduced to numbers. You did not keep your name here, you did not keep your past. The moment the ledger claimed you, you belonged to the system. That was the fate of patient 43. The boy's admission had been perfunctory. He was stripped, washed, given the coarse grey uniform that marked him as defective. No protests, no tears, no attempts at flight. Only that unbroken stare fixed on the surgeon. Attendants remarked how strange it was. Children delivered under the Idiot's Act often wailed, fought, or collapsed into vacant stupor. But not this one. He sat upright, rigid, as though waiting for something. When struck across the shoulder to test his responsiveness, he did not flinch. He only turned his gaze back to the orderly with eyes that seemed too knowing, too deliberate, for a boy branded incapable of comprehension. Already he was feared. Fear does not always come from violence. Sometimes it comes from silence too deep to be human. They gave him a cruel name, asylums often did, a shorthand to dehumanize. They called him the Shadow. Because no matter where Dr. Harrington went, the boy trailed him, step for step, stride for stride. His eyes never strayed from Harrington's hands. If the surgeon lit a lamp, the boy lifted invisible flint and struck the air. If the surgeon tied a knot, the boy's fingers curled, threading nothing. His mimicry was not sloppy, not delayed. It was flawless. He was not guessing, he was rehearsing. In the beginning, Harrington dismissed it. Mimicry was a common symptom of mental defect, a meaningless echo of movements without true understanding, but the boy's exactness troubled him. He did not falter, did not lose rhythm, did not grow bored, he did not stop. One evening, Harrington deliberately altered his motions, turning his wrist unnaturally as he cleaned his scalpel. Across the ward, the boy mirrored the twist instantly, with no hesitation, as though he had anticipated the trick. That was the moment the surgeon's unease began. The staff whispered among themselves. One swore the boy never blinked. Another claimed his lips moved faintly when Harrington spoke, mouthing words he had no way of knowing. Even the matron, who prided herself on discipline, requested that he be confined to another ward. Her request was denied. Patient 43 remained, seated at the foot of his cot, hands twitching at night as though stitching wounds no one else could see. The heart of the asylum, however, was not the ward. It was the theatre. The operating theatre was where reputations were made. Harrington, like many Victorian surgeons, performed dissections and procedures not in secrecy but before audiences of students and staff. Cadavers were brought in from nearby hospitals, paupers, unclaimed dead, and laid out on the stone slab beneath the skylight. Here, Harrington demonstrated his craft, incisions, amputations, dissections, and here too the boy appeared. No one admitted bringing him in. He was not listed for duty, not permitted by rule. But when Harrington lifted a scalpel, the boy was already seated in the shadows, knees pressed together, eyes burning with focus. His hands rose with the surgeon's hands. Every incision was doubled, every cut rehearsed in the air. At first, students chuckled nervously, thinking it some grotesque game, but the laughter faltered as the boy continued stroke for stroke, never missing a beat. When Harrington paused to wipe his blade, the boy wiped invisible steel. When Harrington spread ribs, the boy's hands widened, pulling at bones that were not there. And when Harrington lifted a human heart, glistening under the gaslight, the boy cupped the void in his own trembling hands, as though cradling the weight of something only he could feel. The theater fell silent. One attendant crossed himself, another left the room entirely. What they witnessed was not mimicry, it was something colder, mechanical, perfect, and utterly inescapable. Soon, it was no longer confined to the theater. In the corridors, Harrington bandaged a wound. Across the hall, the boy's fingers tugged phantom cloth. In the gardens, Harrington lit a cigar. The boy inhaled nothing, exhaling phantom smoke into the cold night. Even in chapel, when the surgeon absently crossed himself, the boy's hand rose in the same gesture, not to the altar, but to Harrington's chest. Wherever Harrington went, he was not alone. His shadow rehearsed him, gesture for gesture, as if stripping the surgeon's humanity down to pure mechanics. The attendants began to fear him. Some swore he was not alive in the normal sense, that he was not a child at all, but something sent to reflect, to record, to anticipate. The matron began locking Ward B during dissections, yet each time Harrington entered the theater, the boy was already inside, seated silently, waiting. Doors bolted, corridors watched, rules enforced. It did not matter. The shadow was always there. And then came the first rupture. For weeks his mimicry had been flawless, enslaved to the surgeon's motions, but one morning, in the midst of a crowded dissection, the boy's hands suddenly strayed. Harrington's scalpel moved cleanly across the chest, yet the boy's wrist jerked sideways, too deep, too violent. His face remained expressionless, his eyes never leaving Harrington's hands. But the cut was wrong. It was not mimicry. It was rehearsal of error. Days later, Harrington's own hand slipped in the theater, exactly as the boy had shown. The wound tore deeper than intended. The room gasped. The surgeon, pale, pressed cloth to the bleeding flesh. The boy's hands across the benches clutched his own RE, in silent confirmation. What had been dismissed as coincidence now settled into the bones of everyone present. The boy was no longer copying, he was dictating. That was when fear transformed into something darker. Attendants whispered of prophecy. Nurses refused to enter the theater at all. Harrington, a man of science, fought to suppress his terror. He told himself it was imagination, superstition, fear running wild in an asylum already thick with madness. But at night, when he closed his eyes, he saw them, the boy's thin hands rehearsing over and over, cutting too deep, opening veins, lifting invisible organs into the cold air. Not mimicry, not madness, a rehearsal of death, his death. And if a child could rehearse the death of a surgeon, what else could he rehearse? What else could he bring into being simply by tracing it in the shadows? By midsummer of 1864, patient 43 was no longer just a curiosity. He had become an infection, an unseen force seeping through the wards of Earlswood. His silent rehearsals no longer mimicked only the surgeon. They began to echo through the lives of attendants, nurses, even other patients. And as the whispers spread, so too did the fear that nothing in those walls was coincidence anymore. Death itself was being choreographed, and the boy was its conductor. It began with small gestures. An orderly named Collier reported that while he was binding the wrist of a fevered patient, he noticed the boy sitting across the ward, his thin hands tugging at the air as though pulling bandage tight. Collier ignored it, but later, when the bandage tore open during convulsions, blood staining the cot red, he remembered the boy's sudden twist, the jerking mimicry of cloth ripping. That patient bled out before morning. Collier swore the boy had shown him the ending before it happened. After that, he refused to enter Ward B. "He sees too far," he muttered. "He knows what breaks, before it breaks." Another attendant swore she heard him whispering at night. She described him seated cross-legged on the floor by his cot, rocking back and forth, lips moving in the half-dark. But what words did he whisper? Not prayers, not nonsense. She claimed they were phrases she had overheard only from the surgeon's lips. Steady cut, deeper, retract. Instructions, commands, words a mute child should never have known. When she told the matron her testimony was struck from the duty log, dismissed as hysteria. But the story spread in the dormitory, growing sharper with each telling. The boy was not learning, he was repeating, and not repeating the present, repeating the future. Superstition spread quickly in an asylum. Nurses began refusing to wash his uniform, claiming it smelled of iron, though no stains marked it. One swore she had caught him wringing phantom cloth, twisting the air as though squeezing blood from invisible sleeves. Another claimed she saw him collapse in the corridor, clutching his throat, gasping noiselessly, only to learn hours later that a patient in the fever ward had died, struggling for breath. Coincidence? The staff no longer believed in coincidence. They began to believe in patient 43. Even Harrington could not escape the contagion of belief. Though he fought against it, though he clung to science and anatomy, even he admitted in his private notebook that the boys' rehearsals had become too insistent, too exact. He wrote one damning line, a confession of dread. This is not mimicry. This is rehearsal. And once a man of science admits that he is no longer in command of his own hands, he is already lost. The boy's influence grew not because of noise, but because of silence. He never raised his voice. He never lashed out. He did not need to. His presence gnawed at the nerves of every man and woman who crossed him. In the chapel, attendants whispered that they could not kneel beside him. When the prayers rose, his lips moved, but not to the altar, not to the cross. He mouthed only the surgeon's words, repeating them endlessly in some wordless catechism. Cut here, pull there, deeper now, the gospel of dissection, recited like holy scripture. They began to call him something else, not shadow, not omen. Among themselves, the attendants muttered a darker name, the surgeon's ghost. Though he still breathed, though he still walked, he was treated as though he had already crossed into the grave. The name spread, and with it the sense that the boy no longer lived among them as a patient, but as a presence, half-corporeal, rehearsing endlessly the final act of anyone unlucky enough to fall beneath his gaze. Harrington's demonstrations became haunted performances. Students scribbled fewer notes on anatomy and more on the mimic. One observer wrote in his book, "He does not learn, he repeats. He is the echo of the surgeon, but without flesh." In that sentence lies the true horror. What happens when the echo begins to lead and the voice begins to follow? What happens when the surgeon's own hands tremble, guided not by his mind, but by the silent rehearsal of a child seated in shadow? The moment came again, sharper this time. Harrington was demonstrating the dissection of a limb. His scalpel traced the muscle groups with practiced confidence. And yet across the benches, the boy's hands jerked sideways with violent force, gouging into the air. He clutched his own arm, gasping faintly before resuming his silent mimicry. The room froze. Students exchanged looks, pale, uneasy. Harrington forced himself to continue, but in the pit of his stomach he felt it, the inevitability. The mistake had not yet been made, but it would. It had already been rehearsed into being, from that day forward, every time. He touched a scalpel. Harrington felt the weight of inevitability pressing against him. He dreamed of the boy's thin fingers tracing his own cuts, not reflecting him but commanding him. His confidence drained. His hands shook. The act of cutting, once routine, became terror. For what is the worth of skill if another hand, smaller, unseen, is already carving your mistake before you make it? By July, patient 43 was no longer a boy in the eyes of the staff. He was something else, an omen, a prophecy, a rehearsal of death itself. When a patient convulsed and died, someone claimed the boy had mimed it hours before. When a nurse's husband perished suddenly in town, she swore she had seen the boy gasping for air days earlier. No one could prove it, but no one doubted. Rumor became fact, fear became law, and the asylum itself began to bend under the weight of belief. This is how institutions unravel, not by riot, not by violence, but by whispers that grow heavier than truth. And the greatest whisper of all was this, that the surgeon was no longer master of his own hands, that his fate, like the fate of everyone in those wards, had already been rehearsed by a boy with empty palms. By late summer, the fear in Earlswood no longer belonged to the patients. It belonged to the staff. Hardened attendants who had faced violent lunatics without flinching now avoided Ward B. Nurses crossed themselves before stepping into corridors. Students who once clamored for places in Harrington's theatre begged to be reassigned, because patient 43 had begun rehearsing something new. Not slips, not errors, not wounds. He was rehearsing the surgeon's death. It began with a gesture. Harrington, in the theatre, was tracing a clean incision across a drowned man's chest. His hand was steady, his technique flawless, but across the benches the boy's hands rose higher, trembling in the air. Then, sudden lie, he drove them downward with force, as though plunging knives into a slab. His fingers curled, clutching at something wet, then lifted trembling palms into the gaslight, as if displaying an organ to the unseen. The audience recoiled. Harrington froze, sweat beading at his temples. The boy's face betrayed nothing, no joy, no malice, only that unbroken concentration. The dissection ended abruptly, but the image remained. Every eye had seen it, the child rehearsing not an accident, but a killing blow. From that moment, Harrington could not escape the pressure. His own hands felt heavier with each cut. He could not shake the conviction that he was no longer directing his tools, that the boy, seated silent in the shadows, had already chosen how deep the blade would fall. He began making mistakes. Not catastrophic at first. Hesitations, slight tremors, slips of rhythm. Yet in his private notebook he wrote in a desperate scrawl, He insists without voice. He insists that I will cut too deep, and now I believe him. The attendants whispered of it openly now. They said the boy's rehearsal had shifted, that he no longer mirrored every motion but focused only on Harrington's slips, cuts too deep, arteries opened, veins severed. He repeated these errors endlessly, drilling them into the air until they seemed inevitable. Some claimed he was not merely predicting the surgeon's mistakes, he was willing them into existence, and once rehearsed, they could not be escaped. The matron told her staff not to indulge superstition, but her voice carried no authority anymore. In the wards, they called him the surgeon's ghost. In the dormitories, they muttered he was no longer a child at all. He was an echo of death, sent not to be cured, but to guide the living into the grave. And then came the night Harrington saw the rehearsal of his own end. It was raining. The theatre was empty save for him, a cadaver on the slab, and the hiss of gaslight. He worked late, trying to prove to himself that his hands still obeyed him. But then he heard it. The faint scrape of bare feet across stone. He turned. The boy was there, soaked from the storm, uniform clinging to his small frame. He made no sound, no explanation. He simply raised his arms, elbows bent, hands poised as though holding steel. Harrington lifted his scalpel. The boy mirrored him. And then, without waiting, the boy's wrists jerked violently inward, crossing, stabbing deep into an invisible chest. His fingers twisted, then pulled upward, miming the rupture of flesh. Harrington dropped his blade. For the first time in his career, his hands shook uncontrollably. He fled the theatre, leaving the cadaver half open, convinced that he had witnessed not rehearsal, but prophecy. The following week, the rehearsal grew bolder. During a crowded demonstration, Harrington bent low to dissect the abdomen of a pauper's corpse. The boy's hands mirrored, then suddenly slipped, jerking sideways across his own stomach, dragging upward as if opening his own belly. His thin chest rose and fell rapidly as though in silent exertion. Gasps echoed across the benches. One student muttered a prayer, another left retching. Harrington forced himself to continue, but every nerve screamed at him that he had just watched his own disembowelment rehearsed in advance. That night, the attendants swore they found the boy alone in the morgue, fingers tracing invisible lines across a sheet-covered corpse. He was not opening it in mimicry. He was carving the surgeon's path into the dead, practicing as if preparing for the moment the real flesh would yield. They dragged him back to Ward B, but his hands never stopped moving, twitching against invisible threads long after he lay in bed. The matron said he was dreaming, but the attendants whispered otherwise. He was rehearsing the doctor's death until it became inevitable. The more the boy rehearsed, the weaker Harrington became. His once commanding presence eroded. His lectures grew clipped, his confidence drained. He began avoiding his own instruments, trembling as he reached for scalpels. He stopped smoking in the garden, afraid the boy would mimic his last breath. Even in chapel, when he crossed himself, he felt the weight of the boy's silent gesture echoing the sign, not as devotion, but as a mark upon his chest, a rehearsal of the coffin to come. And so the institution, built upon discipline and hierarchy, began to decay. What use were governors, matrons, surgeons, when one silent boy could unmake them with nothing more than empty hands? Order unraveled. Rumors bloomed unchecked. Attendants avoided their duties, terrified of crossing the boy's path. Nurses spoke of leaving entirely. Even the ledger, the asylum's book of truth, fell prey to fear. Notes of his behavior were struck through, blotted, erased, as though ink itself could cage him. But everyone knew the truth. What was written could be denied, but what was rehearsed could not. Do you see now? Patient 43 was more than a boy. He was a rupture in the fabric of power, a reminder that control is fragile, that the authority of institutions can be overturned not by violence, but by inevitability. For what defense does a surgeon have when his every slip, his every wound, his very death itself has already been rehearsed over and over until the body obeys the shadow? Harrington tried to resist. He told himself it was madness, hysteria, the paranoia of an asylum infected by superstition, but every time he lifted a blade, he saw the boy's hands moving first. Every time he tried to forget, the boy rehearsed again, and slowly, inexorably, the surgeon began to believe. For in the theatre of death, belief is the sharpest scalpel, and once you believe, the cut is already made. By autumn, Earlswood was no longer an asylum. It was a theatre. And the director of every act was not the surgeon, nor the matron, nor the governors who signed reports in tidy handwriting. It was the boy, patient 43, the one who rehearsed death until it stepped obediently into reality. The institution's order began to unravel. Attendants abandoned corridors if they saw him seated silently at the end, rocking back and forth, hands twitching in motions only he understood. Nurses refused to enter Ward B after dusk, claiming they heard him whispering in the dark. Words that were not words, more like echoes of scalpel strokes, dissection notes, instructions to invisible hands. Even the parish officer who had first delivered him returned months later, curious about his condition, only to leave shaken pale, muttering that the child had stared at him until he felt his own chest tighten, as though a blade already rested between his ribs. The governors buried the report. They had no appetite for scandal, but their silence did not silence the staff. Fear spread like infection. The asylum was built on control. Every patient was meant to be catalogued, reduced, numbered, and regimented into predictability, but patient 43 could not be contained. Lock him in a ward and he appeared in the theatre. Count him in bed, and moments later he was seated in the operating hall. Place attendants at doors, and still he was already inside when the surgeon arrived. He followed no schedule, no record, no chain of command. And that terrified them more than his silence. For an institution thrives on the illusion that its walls are unbreakable. But here was a boy who slipped through locks and duty rosters as though they were nothing. And worse, he rehearsed futures that came true. Superstition hardened into ritual. Before operations, some staff whispered prayers under their breath. Others refused to look at the boy, saying that meeting his gaze was like catching your reflection in a coffin lid. The matron ordered that his presence in the theatre be stricken from all ledgers. If it is not written, it cannot exist, she told the clerks. Yet the ink stains only proved the opposite. The more they tried to erase him, the more powerful his shadow became. Patient 43 became the truth beneath the lie. Harrington himself began to rot under the pressure. His hands, once steady as marble, now trembled at the touch of steel. He avoided demonstrations claiming illness, but the governors forced him to continue. The asylum was built on display, and Harrington was its centerpiece. Yet every time he raised a scalpel, the boy's hands rose first, and sometimes the boy rehearsed not the cut, but the error, the slip too deep, the artery severed, the fatal stroke. Students no longer scribbled anatomy in their notebooks. They scribbled the boy. One note survives, hidden in a private journal discovered years later. The child rehearses not what is, but what must be. We watch not the surgeon, but his ghost. And then the rehearsals began to spread beyond Harrington. One night a nurse swore she saw the boy collapse against a wall, clutching his chest, gasping noiselessly. Hours later, an attendant died of sudden seizure. Another time, the boy doubled over in the garden, miming violent spasms. The next morning, a fever patient convulsed and bled out. Coincidence? That word no longer existed inside Earlswood. To them, the boy rehearsed all death. He was not merely the surgeon's shadow, he was the asylum's undertaker. By now, the institution itself had grown sick. Routines broke down. Patients sensed the fear in their keepers and grew restless, violent, ungovernable. Attendants who once barked orders now lingered near doors, glancing nervously toward Ward B. The matron, desperate to reassert control, banned all mention of the boy's shadow play, but words are weaker than inevitability. He continued rehearsing in silence, and each new death confirmed his prophecy. The asylum was no longer under the governor's rule, it was under his. One evening, Harrington lingered in the chapel long after the others had left. His notes, his only refuge, lay scattered across the pew. He prayed, though not to God. He prayed for his own hands. He begged them to obey him again. Yet when he rose to cross himself, he froze. The boy was seated in the back pew, silent as always, eyes locked on the surgeon's chest. And when Harrington traced the sign of the cross, the boy's thin hand rose too, not as devotion but as verdict. The surgeon fled into the night. From that moment he knew. It was no longer a question of if patient 43 would rehearse his death. It was only a question of when. The governors knew too. They did not admit it in words, but their actions betrayed them. Reports about patient 43 ceased. His number was struck from records. His behaviors were described in vague euphemisms: wandering, repetitive gesture, attendance unsettled. It was bureaucratic language meant to bury terror beneath ink. But the staff knew better. The boy had grown beyond the ledger. He was a shadow stitched into the fabric of Earlswood. And though they tried to erase him, his rehearsals carved themselves into the flesh of everyone who walked those halls. The truth is this: patient 43 revealed something Victorian England could never admit: that institutions built on control are brittle, that authority is an illusion, and that the future itself can be dictated by a child too silent to speak. His rehearsals were not mere mimicry, they were instructions, and once rehearsed, death became inevitable. And here in the middle of the descent, I ask you to prove you are awake. If you have followed this far, type the phrase "shadows cut twice" in the comments. Type it twice, not once, because repetition is power, because what is rehearsed becomes real, because in writing it, you join the chain of inevitability that even the governors of Earlswood could not escape. By October, Dr. William Harrington was no longer the surgeon of Earlswood Asylum. Not in spirit, not in will. His body moved, yes, his hands still grasped scalpels, his voice still recited anatomy, but the authority that once animated him had been leached away. It belonged now to the boy, the silent figure who rehearsed his every slip until the surgeon believed in them more than in his own skill. And once belief has taken root, it cannot be uprooted. It grows like rot in the marrow. Harrington began to dream. At first, the dreams were simple reflections, his own hands replaying the motions of his work. But as weeks passed, the dreams turned grotesque. He saw the boy's thin fingers cutting deeper than he had ever dared, tearing through flesh with inhuman confidence, opening bodies with the inevitability of ritual. Sometimes Harrington woke to find his own hands moving in the dark, fingers twitching as though stitching phantom wounds. He began sleeping with his hands tied to the bed frame, ashamed but terrified of what they might perform in the night. The boy's presence became unbearable in waking hours. Harrington could not escape him. He sat outside the surgeon's quarters at dawn, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the case of surgical tools, as though listening to them whisper through the wood. He trailed Harrington in the corridors, step for step, until the surgeon no longer knew whether he was leading or being led. In chapel, he mirrored the surgeon's gestures with such solemn weight that Harrington felt he was watching his own funeral. Even in the gardens, the boy shadowed his every inhalation, miming smoke that was not there, breath that did not belong to him. The surgeon began to lose his own reflection in the boy's shadow. The staff saw the deterioration and whispered. Some claimed Harrington had grown hollow-eyed, gaunt, trembling as though fevered. Others said his Hair had gone white in patches that his hands shook not only in the theatre, but in every simple task, lifting a spoon, lighting a lamp, writing his name. The truth was sharper. His mind was unraveling under the conviction that his death was no longer in his hands. It had already been rehearsed. And once rehearsed, it was inevitable. One evening, after a dissection of an unclaimed pauper's corpse, Harrington lingered in the theatre, alone save for the boy. The gaslight hissed, shadows swam on the walls. Harrington set down his scalpel and turned to confront him at last. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The boy gave no answer. He only raised his hands and began the familiar gesture, the downward plunge, the violent twist, the opening of an invisible wound. Harrington staggered back, breath shallow, sweat running cold down his spine. For in that moment he realized the truth. The boy did not want anything. He was not bargaining, he was not threatening, he was only rehearsing, and rehearsal does not stop until performance arrives. Harrington's private notes grew frantic. He no longer wrote in tidy lines, but in jagged phrases across margins. He insists, not mimicry, repetition of what will come. He rehearses my end until I believe. One entry, scrawled in near illegible haste, read, "What is practice but prophecy?" It was the confession of a man no longer anchored in science, but drowned in inevitability. The asylum itself reflected his decay. Discipline dissolved, patients grew unruly, sensing the weakness of their keepers. Attendants bickered, some fleeing posts entirely. The matron ordered silence on the subject of patient 43, forbidding any mention of his shadow play. But words cannot suppress inevitability. Every time Harrington touched steel, the boy rehearsed his slip. Every time another patient died, someone swore they had seen the and boy mimic it in advance. The institution's order rotted from within, its very foundation gnawed by whispers that truth lay not in the governor's reports, but in the boy's empty hands. And still, Harrington was forced to perform. The governors demanded their surgeon prove the asylum's worth with public demonstrations. Visitors from London arrived to witness the reforms of science upon the feeble-minded. Harrington stood in the theatre, pale and trembling, his instruments gleaming under the skylight. The cadaver lay ready. The students watched, and in the corner sat the boy, already poised, hands raised. Harrington lifted his scalpel. His hand shook. Across the room, the boy's hand was steady. He rehearsed every stroke as though leading the surgeon, not following. Harrington's incision faltered, and murmurs rippled through the benches. He pressed on, forcing confidence, but sweat ran down his brow. For with each movement, he realized the boy was no longer mirroring him. He was dictating tempo, rhythm, even hesitation. Harrington was no longer surgeon. He was puppet. And the strings were pulled by a child too silent to speak. That night, Harrington wrote in his journal, "I am not the operator. I am operated upon. My hand is no longer mine." He burned the page after writing it, ashamed, yet the ashes could not erase the truth. The staff already knew. They avoided his gaze. They whispered that the surgeon was not long for this world. They said the boy had chosen him, and once chosen, no one escaped. The horror was not in violence, not in outburst. The horror was in inevitability. In watching a man of science eroded piece by piece until he believed more in the prophecy of a child's empty hands than in his own skill. That is how corruption spreads, not by force, but by belief. And once belief has consumed you, performance is certain. By November, Harrington no longer fought the rehearsals. He awaited them. Every morning he opened his case and glanced at the boy before touching a blade, as though seeking permission. Every night he dreamt of being opened, of hands smaller than his own cutting deeper, faster, more precise. And when he woke, trembling, he could not say with certainty whether he had dreamed or whether the rehearsal had already begun. By November, the asylum no longer spoke of Harrington and the boy as separate beings. Whispers in the dormitories, passed under breath between attendants too afraid to say them aloud, had fused the two together, the surgeon and his ghost. Some believed they were bound by fate, Others muttered that the boy was no patient at all, but Harrington's reflection made flesh, a mirror that had stepped out of glass, rehearsing his end until they were no longer two men, but one shadow split between two bodies. Harrington, once a man of precision, was dissolving. His shoulders sagged, his gait slowed, his words faltered mid-sentence. In the wards, attendants saw him hesitate before even the simplest procedure, glancing not at his instruments, but toward the boy, as though awaiting instruction. They said the surgeon no longer cut by knowledge, but by echo, that he would not act until the boy's hands moved first. And in that inversion lay the true terror. The institution built on hierarchy, where doctor ruled patient, had been overturned. The surgeon had become apprentice to a child who never spoke. Even the patients, dulled by neglect, began to sense it. One girl in Ward A pointed toward the theatre doors and whispered, "Two men with one hand." When pressed, she said no more, but her words traveled swiftly among the staff, feeding the superstition already festering. Two men, one hand, one shadow rehearsing the other until they were inseparable, and if the shadow rehearsed death, then death itself had already crossed the threshold. Harrington's dreams worsened. He recorded fragments in his notebook, though the entries grew jagged, incoherent. He cut before I lifted steel. My blood in his hands, not mine. Not patient, rehearsal itself. At times Harrington claimed he saw the boy in his chambers at night, seated in the corner, hands trembling, cutting through the air with invisible scalpel. He would rise, lantern shaking, only to find the chair empty. But in the morning, the boy was always there, seated outside his door, waiting, silent. As though the night's rehearsal had been real after all. The matron, frantic to preserve order, issued new decrees. The boy was to be confined to his cot during procedures. Ward doors were to be bolted at night. Guards were placed outside the theatre. Yet nothing worked. When Harrington entered the operating room, the boy was always there already, seated in shadow. No one admitted opening the doors. No record showed his removal from the ward. It was as if the asylum itself had begun conspiring with him, bending its walls to ensure his presence. Discipline faltered further. Attendants refused to sit in the theatre. Students begged to leave Earlswood altogether, and the governors, confronted with mounting reports of unrest, responded with silence. They struck patient 43's name from the ledgers entirely, reducing him to absence. But absence is not erasure. The boy did not need ink to exist. His rehearsals were carved into living flesh. The climax of inevitability came one Thursday morning. The theatre was crowded, students, attendants, even a visiting magistrate. Harrington stood pale at the slab, tools glinting beneath the skylight. A cadaver lay ready. The air was heavy with anticipation, and there at the lowest bench the boy sat, knees together, eyes unblinking, hands poised. Harrington lifted his scalpel. The boy's hands rose instantly, miming the steel, and then, before the surgeon could begin, the boy jerked his wrists violently inward, driving invisible blades across his own chest. His fingers twisted, pulling upward as though opening himself from sternum to throat. Gasps erupted across the benches. The magistrate muttered a curse. Harrington froze, sweat dripping onto the cadaver. And in that silence, every man and woman in the room understood the truth. They had not come to watch a dissection. They had come to watch a rehearsal of the surgeon's death. Harrington forced himself forward, cutting with trembling hand. But every stroke was doubled, every slip rehearsed seconds before it occurred. He nicked too deep. He hesitated mid-cut. His sutures faltered. Students shifted uneasily. The magistrate left in disgust. And all the while the boy carved invisible wounds into the air, dictating the rhythm, commanding the inevitability. When Harrington finally dropped his scalpel, the demonstration ended not with applause, but with silence. The surgeon had lost control. His shadow had claimed him. From that day, even his colleagues began to speak of him as already dead. One clerk wrote in a private diary, "Dr. Harrington still walks the halls, but his hands belong to another. He is no longer surgeon, only shadow." The boy, meanwhile, grew more relentless. He rehearsed constantly, in wards, in corridors, in the gardens at night. Attendants swore they saw him tearing open invisible throats, jerking limbs apart, clutching organs no one else could see. Each time, within days, someone died. Whether patient, nurse, or attendant, the rehearsal was followed by reality. Coincidence no longer shielded them. They believed, and belief is prophecy's sharpest blade. Harrington, too, ceased to resist. His notes reveal a final surrender. I am rehearsed until I am nothing. He rehearses me because I am already gone. The handwriting broke off midline, ink smearing as, though his hand had failed him. That was the last entry found in his private desk. Soon after, his name disappeared from asylum records. The governors wrote of transfer and illness, but no trace of his fate survives. Only whispers that one evening in the theatre, Harrington collapsed mid-demonstration, his chest opening beneath his own trembling hand exactly as the boy had rehearsed for months. No official ledger records it. Only the stain of erasure remains. And the boy? He did not scream. He did not flee. He simply mimed the surgeon's final gesture once more, steady and calm, before folding his hands in his lap as though the performance was complete. When Dr. William Harrington vanished from the ledgers, the asylum did not pause to mourn. Institutions do not grieve. They erase. The governors of Earlswood wrote bland euphemisms into the record. Transferred. Ill health. No longer in post. His name was crossed through as neatly as a line of arithmetic, but paper cannot smother whispers. Among staff and patients, his absence was more than bureaucracy. It was proof that patient 43 had rehearsed a man into nothingness. The theatre was scrubbed clean. New scalpel sets were ordered. A younger surgeon was brought in from London, brimming with optimism and blind to what had transpired. But the walls remembered. Attendants avoided the operating benches, refusing to sit where they had watched Harrington's shadow rehearsed. Students muttered excuses, claiming illness to avoid lectures. The theatre, once the pride of the asylum, became a chamber of dread, for everyone who had witnessed it knew that Harrington had not slipped, not faltered, not grown ill. He had been rehearsed into death, and once rehearsal is complete, performance follows. Patient 43 remained. The governors, desperate to salvage order, attempted a new strategy. Silence. His number was stricken from all duty logs. His name never appeared in Clark's reports. He was described only in vague phrases. Unremarkable. Quiet. Patisse. And stable. But ink cannot lie to memory. Attendants knew he was still there. They saw him each dawn seated outside the theatre doors before they were unlocked, hands folded neatly in his lap. They saw him in the corridors, miming sutures in the air. They saw him in the chapel, making the sign of the cross not to heaven, but to his own chest. They saw him in the morgue, tracing invisible incisions across the shrouds of the unclaimed dead. He was present everywhere, though on paper he did not exist at all. The erasure only deepened the fear. It is one thing to confront horror, another to pretend it does not exist while feeling its breath on your neck. Nurses whispered that the governors had struck out his name not to protect order, but to protect themselves. If the boy rehearsed Harrington into oblivion, what prevented him from rehearsing them? Governors may command with ink, but ink is powerless against inevitability. More deaths followed. A patient in Ward C convulsed and choked one night. Hours earlier, an attendant swore she had seen the boy rocking in silence, hands clutching his own throat. Another time, an orderly was struck in the head by a falling beam during repairs. Days before, the boy had sat in the garden, miming the collapse of something heavy onto his skull. No one laughed at the coincidences anymore. Each death was preceded by rehearsal, and each rehearsal was whispered through the asylum until belief became certainty. The younger surgeon, eager to stamp his authority, mocked the superstition. He told the staff that the boy was nothing more than a mimic, an idiot child repeating gestures without meaning. He dismissed Harrington's decline as exhaustion, the imagination of weak men who had spent too long among the feeble-minded, but his words rang hollow. For when he entered the theatre to perform his first dissection, he froze. Patient 43 was already there, seated on the lowest bench, hands poised, and when the surgeon lifted his scalpel, the boy's hands rose with him, steady, exact. Students noted the man's hesitation, his faltering cut. Afterward, he stormed from the room, pale, refusing to acknowledge the boy, but the staff saw the truth. Authority had shifted again. Even a new surgeon fresh from London was not immune to the shadow. By December, Earlswood lived under two realities. The official reality was neat, orderly, bureaucratic. Patients were catalogued, reports filed, progress made. But the lived reality was darker, whispered in dormitories and scrawled in margins of private diaries. Patient 43 dictated the future. His rehearsals were law. He was not patient, not child, not idiot. He was inevitability itself. One nurse confessed in her personal letter, later intercepted but never delivered. He does not imitate. He commands. His hands show what must be, and then it happens. We all live rehearsed now, waiting for the cut we have already seen. The letter was seized, the nurse dismissed, her words buried. Yet her fear lingered in those who remained. For each of them, whether they admitted it or not, had seen the same truth. Reality was not written by governors or surgeons. It was written in the silent rehearsal of a boy no ledger could contain. And so the asylum bent itself to silence. The staff avoided his gaze. The new surgeon refused to speak his number. The governors pressed ink harder into their ledgers, hoping the weight of erasure would break prophecy. But the rehearsals continued. At night, attendants swore they heard faint slashes in the air, like blades cutting through nothing. Some claimed they woke to find him standing by their cots, hands trembling, tracing invisible wounds across their sleeping bodies. Whether real or imagined no longer mattered. Belief had already chosen the ending. This is how institutions collapse, not with riots, but with silence. By denying what everyone knows, they leave it to grow in the shadows. Unstoppable, inevitable. Patient 43 thrived in that silence. The less he was named, the more he became legend. The less he was written, the more he became truth. And the staff understood, even if the governors did not. You cannot erase inevitability. You cannot blot out rehearsal. You can only wait for the performance. And so the asylum held its breath, waiting for the next cut. The governors of Earlswood believed they could bury Patient 43 with silence. They believed that if his name was struck from ledgers, if his presence was described in vague euphemisms, then the world outside their walls would never know. But silence is not absence. Silence is an infection, and by winter of 1864, it had already spread beyond the asylum. Whispers leaked into the village of Redhill. Attendants, too afraid to return home without speaking, confided to their families that a child within the asylum rehearsed death until it obeyed. Mothers whispered it in kitchens, fathers carried it to the taverns. Soon the parish heard of it, cloaked in rumor. The boy who mimed death, the boy who rehearsed surgeons into their graves. Some dismissed it as nonsense, others crossed themselves and refused to speak of it again. But rumors, like shadows, lengthen at dusk. And this rumor grew with each telling. Clergy warned against it from pulpits, framing it as blasphemy. They called the boy a vessel of evil, a mockery of God's authority over life and death. But their warnings only gave the story shape. Parishioners whispered more fiercely after sermons, imagining the child rocking in lamplight, his hands carving invisible wounds. The tale of Patient 43 was becoming myth. And myths do not obey governors, they outlive them. Inside Earlswood, the governors fought harder. They forbade staff from speaking of him outside the war. They censored letters, dismissed attendants who spread rumor, and reinforced discipline with threats. But their efforts came too late. Even their own clerks began omitting details from reports, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. They believed that to write of him was to invoke him, that ink itself could summon his rehearsal into reality. The ledgers grew thinner, vaguer, until the institution's history became a blur of half-truths. And at the center of that blur was the boy, silent, patient, inevitable. Deaths continued. A ward attendant was found in the laundry, neck broken by a fall down stone steps. Hours earlier, another staff member had glimpsed the boy in the stairwell, head tilted at an unnatural angle, miming the jerking snap of vertebrae. A fever patient expired after sudden hemorrhage. Days before, the boy had been seen in chapel, fingers twitching across his abdomen, peeling open invisible flesh. By now, no one called it coincidence. They called it rehearsal. They said he was practicing every death before it arrived, and that to witness his gestures was to glimpse the inevitable. The new surgeon did not last. Within weeks of Harrington's disappearance, he too had grown pale, nervous, his hands unsteady. He refused to perform in the theatre if the boy was present, yet no matter what orders were given, the boy was always there. When the surgeon lifted his tools, the shadow hands rose. When he hesitated, the shadow cut ahead. Finally, the surgeon fled Earlswood altogether, resigning in a letter that made no mention of patient 43, but described his work as impossible under conditions beyond reason. He returned to London. His name, like Harrington's, vanished from records soon after. The asylum could no longer pretend. Staff whispered openly now. Some claimed patient 43 had grown bolder, rehearsing not only deaths but burials, miming the digging of graves, too, the folding of sheets, the lowering of unseen bodies into earth. Others swore he had begun rehearsing even their thoughts, tilting his head when they spoke as though repeating their words in silence. He had become more than shadow. He was rehearsal itself, an inevitability wearing the shell of a boy, and yet beyond those walls, the world carried on. The governor's silence campaign succeeded in one sense. No newspapers printed the tale, no medical journals recorded him. Patient 43 does not appear in Victorian reform pamphlets or in the triumphal reports of Earlswood's governors. To history he does not exist, but to those who worked there, to those who whispered his story in taverns and kitchens, he became unforgettable. One villager's diary, discovered decades later, contains a chilling entry. The nurses say he rehearses all who cross him, not madness, not play. He practices the act until the act arrives. Harrington fell, others will. They say no one escapes rehearsal, not even governors. The entry ends abruptly as though the writer could not bear to put more into ink. By early 1865, the asylum itself seemed to bend beneath his presence. Corridors echoed with silence heavier than screams. Patients, once restless, grew eerily still when he entered, their babbling stilled as though sensing a conductor's baton. Attendants muttered that even madness bowed to him, that he was not a child rehearsing death, but death rehearsing itself through a child. And so the governors made their final decision. If he could not be silenced with ink, if he could not be contained with locks, then he would be erased altogether. No transfer, no burial, no record. Erasure absolute. Patient 43 would vanish not into ledger or grave, but into nothing. They summoned parish officers, drafted orders, and prepared to remove him from Earlswood under cover of night. But history does not record where he went. Some claim he was taken to another asylum, buried deeper in silence, rehearsing unseen. Others say he never left, that the orders were carried out in ink only, and the boy remained in the shadows of Earlswood until its closure. A darker tale, whispered years later, says he rehearsed even the act of his own removal, tracing invisible journeys through corridors until attendants swore he was gone, though no one ever saw him leave. What is certain is this. Patient 43 vanished from all surviving records after 1865. His number is absent. His name, if he ever had one, remains unknown. And yet his story persisted, traveling through whispers, diaries, confessions. The boy who rehearsed death until surgeons obeyed. The child who erased men of science by rehearsing their ends. The shadow that institutions could blot from ink, but not from memory. And even now, if you listen to the silence too closely, if you stare at still hands in the corner of your vision, you may wonder, who is rehearsing you? There is a reason you have never read of patient 43 in any official archive, any Victorian reform pamphlet, or any medical journal. His story was not lost. It was buried, erased deliberately, because what he revealed was not simply strange, or unsettling, or superstitious. It was corrosive. It struck at the foundations of power itself. Think of what his existence meant. The asylum was built on hierarchy. Governors commanding surgeons, surgeons commanding attendants, attendants commanding patients. But patient 43 inverted that order. He did not speak, yet he dictated. He did not cut, yet he commanded the cut. He rehearsed deaths into inevitability, stripping surgeons of their authority, governors of their control, even attendants of their confidence. He proved that institutions are fragile, that the authority they claim is an illusion, and that belief itself, once broken, cannot be rebuilt. This is why the governors erased him, because his shadow proved something they could never admit aloud. That power is not held by those who claim it, but by those who dictate belief. Harrington, a surgeon trained in science, collapsed not because of a child's silence, but because of his own belief in that silence. Once he believed that the boy rehearsed his death, he was already dead. And the staff, once they believed, were no longer attendants but witnesses to inevitability. This is the forbidden truth. Control does not collapse under force. It collapses under belief. A single boy rehearsed inevitability so convincingly that an entire institution unraveled. That is why his number was struck from the ledgers. That is why you will not find him in archives. He was not erased because he was meaningless. He was erased because he was too powerful. But history has a way of leaking through cracks. Diaries survive, whispers echo, rumors slip into taverns and pulpits, and over time, the myth of the boy who rehearsed death grew stronger than the ledgers that denied him. To the villagers of Red Hill, he became a warning. To nurses dismissed from Earlswood, he became a confession. To attendants who fled their posts, he became a haunting. And now to you, listening in this moment, he becomes something more, a revelation. Ask yourself, how many others have been erased? How many shadows rehearsed endings until institutions broke only to be struck from the record? How many idiots and lunatics discarded by history carried truths too corrosive to be preserved? You will not find them in books. You will not see them in archives, but they remain, woven through the fabric of silence, waiting for someone willing to listen. And here is the most dangerous part. Patient 43 is not confined to the 19th century. His story is not a relic of Victorian superstition. His lesson is eternal. For what he revealed is not about scalpels, not about asylums, not even about death. It is about inevitability, about the way belief shapes reality. About the way repetition, rehearsal, conviction itself can bend the future until it breaks. Every institution still believes it commands. Governments, churches, corporations, all built on the same illusion that power flows downward. But what happens when belief shifts? What happens when the shadow rehearses something different and the audience begins to believe? History tells us institutions collapse, surgeons fall, governors vanish, ledgers are rewritten, and all that remains is the shadow, cutting air with empty hands until the body obeys. Perhaps that is why you feel unsettled now, because you realize this is not just a story of a boy in 1864. It is a mirror held up to you. How much of your life is mimicry? How much of your fate is already rehearsed by forces you cannot see, by hands you will never touch? You believe you move freely, but what if you are only following gestures rehearsed in silence long before you arrived? What if inevitability has already chosen your end, and you are only catching up? The governors of Earlswood believed they could erase the boy with ink. They were wrong. He survived not in ledgers, but in whispers, and whispers survive longer than archives. Even now, across centuries, across oceans you hear him. His silence has reached you. His rehearsals, etched into the air of a Victorian asylum, echo into this moment. You are listening because inevitability wants you to listen. And now comes the final question. If patient 43 rehearsed every death he saw, if his hands traced not mimicry but prophecy, then what death is he rehearsing now? Whose throat is he clutching in invisible fingers at this very moment? Whose chest is he opening beneath lamplight, silently, inevitably? The governors believed they had buried him. But what if rehearsal cannot be buried? What if it continues, generation after generation, invisible but inevitable, waiting for each of us in turn? So listen carefully. If tonight, in the dim glow of your own room, you see hands twitching at the edge of your vision, carving invisible lines across the dark, do not look too long, do not believe, because once you believe, it is already too late. The rehearsal is complete, and the performance is waiting.